So when you're on Haven1, when the developer builds that kind of product, essentially you automatically limit who interacts with you. There's different levels of verification, of course. There's different people in different countries. So developers got that advantage that they can already set that up in terms of who they want to sell T-bills to, who they don't want to sell T-bills to, whatnot. So that's a huge plus.
Hi everyone, wherever you are, I hope you're having a wonderful week so far. We hear the latest episode of the Inside Crypto Show, interviews and discussion with regular people just like yourselves. Today we are joined by Akash Mahendra, who is the portfolio manager at the digital wealth platform Yield App, as well as the director of the Haven1 Foundation, where he leads strategy, operations, and risk management efforts in support of Haven1. That is a lot. We're going to be talking lots about Haven today. Before we get into that, we have to talk about Akash's background. Akash, thank you so much for making time today. Tell us about yourself.
Thanks for having me, Kriyan. So yeah, it's a bit of an interesting story. I come from a legal background. I was previously a child protection lawyer for the Department of Justice here in Australia before I started working in the digital asset space. So I first got involved, I think, in crypto around 2017, 2018. That was when the first Bitcoin hard fork happened. And from then on, I was hooked into the industry. There was so much to learn. And at that time, I didn't really know what was going on. I got a chance to have a chat with the people who worked in the industry, as well as developers, as well as just general investors during the bear market of 2017, 2018. And then the real DeFi play started in mid 2020 or so. So that's when all the excitement came around, and it just made a lot of great connections, built up my network. And to this day, I'm still pretty tight with a lot of the people who I met back then. Yeah, I started working in a decentralized insurance company based out of Austin. That was my first foray into crypto. On the side, we also ran an investment fund. That was one of those early DAOs. We invested in early stage projects, got to learn a lot about the technology and the risk management, as well as just really get involved in the space very intimately, rather than just being on the sidelines. After a couple of years, I joined the DeFi portfolio and the risk team at Yield App. I previously knew Tim Frost, the CEO, who at Yield App, as I was like a seed investor there, and we had a previous relationship. Internally, we built up our own risk model there. It was focused on the smart contract side and a lot of historical data on the exposure to DeFi and all the attack vectors that lead to those critical loss factors. So it was a big experience working in the portfolio team in Yield Up, especially during the contagion, which happened in 2022. That's when all the blue chips and all the big companies started falling. And from then on, we discussed what the industry needs, which is what led me to Haven1, a layer one blockchain, which is focused on security and regulatory compliance, which is what we are working on right at the moment.
Nice. That's really interesting. And as we were talking before the show, right, we have had a few Australian guests on. And given it's like halfway to 2024, what's the Australian crypto environment like, regulatory speaking, at the moment? Are companies excited? Are there just building? What's your feeling about that?
In Australia, there's quite a bit of activity happening, but in terms of regulation and the stance that's taken by the ASIC, which is the equivalent of the SEC here, there's more of an upbeat stance on the raises as well as like the new companies coming up. There's more clarity than I'd say in America. A lot of the big banks here developing their own stable coins and managing liabilities of a bank through the digital Australian dollar. So quite a bit is happening in terms on that front. And our Reserve Bank here is also collaborating with a couple of big digital companies on finding a use for the Australian CBDC. There's a lot of research, the big research project going on. They're trying to explore like the potential use cases and the economic benefits of a CBDC. So there's a lot happening here in terms of trying to transform the Australian economy into a digital asset, for better or for worse. But there is a bit of progress happening on this end.
Nice. And you speaking to family and friends, of course, like everyone knows you, you're Akash, like you're involved in crypto and stuff. So maybe they're more positive. What's the general sort of perception about crypto in Australia at the moment? I know, like looking back at last year, right? I think we had this, or maybe 2021, this high of everyone was excited, Dogecoin, meme coins, Ethereum, Bitcoin, and then things happened, as you mentioned, last year. And then I feel like it's mooted, like in the States and in the EU. Even in Asia, it's still happening here in Taiwan and Japan, Korea, but it's not really talked about that much. Is that sort of what's going on in Australia, or is there more like a greater depth of conversation going on over there?
To be honest, still a few of my friends are involved in this space. They're not working in this space per se, but they do invest in digital assets. You know, the more younger people you find here, that they do invest in that area. I don't really get involved with discussions about crypto or digital assets as my family. That's a big red flag generally, because you always hear these stories that people tell their families to invest in XYZ coin or invest in Bitcoin the wrong time. I don't really get involved in that, trying to steer away from those conversations. The public sentiment, I don't think it's very positive, given that the news cycles here still revolve around what's happened last year, which is everything was turned out to be a scam, or all the wrong companies made the headlines. There was continuous barrage of information at the start of the Luna collapse. There's 3AC, one of the biggest hedge funds, or it was turned out to be playing around with people's money. Then there's, of course, the Celsius issues, and then the FTX and Voyager and whatever. The whole fallouts, one after the other. Each block just kept falling. I think that's still in the minds of a lot of the people here. I haven't seen too much positive news stories or news cycle in terms of what's going on, but I'm hoping that once we do get some of these big developments and regulation coming in Australia, but also in America and Europe, the sentiment does change. Not really holding my breath for the short-term future, overall bullish for medium and long-term.
And I think that's what a lot of people agree on, the medium to long-term at the moment, but you never know what's going to happen. Akash, thank you so much for that introduction. And it's so nice being able to speak to guests from all around the world, and I'm always curious about what's happening in Australia. As a former South African as well, even though I live in Taiwan, Australia and South Africa always have an interesting relationship. Let's get talking about Haven1, which is really interesting, not to mention about Yield app, and maybe if we have time, we'll talk about that towards the end, we'll see. So going on to the Haven1 website. So if you're watching this podcast on YouTube, and most of you do, you could probably pause here and you can go Google Haven1 and then continue, and maybe comment down in the YouTube comments if you have any questions, and I'll pass them on to Akash. So you go onto the website, and one of the first things that just like immediately caught my eye was secure and regulated. And I think that's really interesting. It's very rare to see a crypto site mention at least regulated, even secure at some point. So let's touch on secure, and maybe you can explain to our audience about what does that mean.
So pretty much we're, I think, around 5 billion DeFi exploits across smart contracts over the past couple of years. And this figure is actually increasing year on year. So things are getting worse. And so as we come up with new innovations and developments in the DeFi space and other technology, digital assets technology, we're going to create all new sorts of attack vectors, new sorts of problems. And that's just the reality. We're not going to reduce the risk as we go on. We're going to keep coming up with new sort of issues that can be attacked, can be broken, and even battle-tested protocols such as, say, Balancer or like Compound, and all these ones have issues. There was a issue with Balancer early in the year with their boosted pools technology when they had to take emergency measure from the multi-sig. So there's different variations of safe DeFi protocols, but I wouldn't say there's 100% guaranteed that anything's going to be safe. That's why we're building Haven1. Haven1 is built through Gocorum, which is a client which allows us to enable enhanced private permissioning as well as network permissioning. It's a capability which is not found in Ethereum or any L1 or L2 blockchains. So all permissions on Haven1 are managed at an individual node level. They allow for creation of specific rules on the blockchain, and they offer significant flexibility for us in managing these account level access controls. One of the safety measures that we are deploying on Haven1 is that there's going to be controlled deployment of contracts. So any contract or protocol that needs to be deployed on Haven1 has to pass through a governance process, and through the governance process, it'll be whitelisted. And essentially our plan is that we're going to use the extensive risk model that our team made in Yield app. We're going to use that risk model to judge and navigate each contract that needs to be deployed, each protocol that needs to be deployed on chain, and to make sure that they fulfill certain criteria and meet the industry standards before deploying on Haven1. Each protocol will need to be deployed after going through a bunch of contracts. What we found is after 2 contracts, you have a 73% risk reduction, and after about 3 audits of the same contract, you have about 99.9% risk reduction on the same bytecode. We're going to employ those permissions, and that automatically limits a certain amount of risk. There'll be controls around that. We can get into other sort of specific things we're going to look at, such as a provable identity framework. That's something that each individual user needs to be verified to use the chain, because that allows for another layer of control, another layer of security for everyone. That will prevent malicious actors from using the network. That's going to reduce the risk of fraud, and it's going to allow for protection of user data. And so there's a lot of different mechanisms that we are going to use to make sure Haven1 is safe and the user's funds are more secure than other blockchains.
That's extremely impressive. As you're explaining the multi-layered approach, the cogs are turning in my brain. And I guess one of the first off-the-cuff questions would be like, was this the intention when you guys were working out the ideas for Haven1? You're like, you wanted this multi-layered approach, or did it evolve into being this multi-layered approach that it is currently at the moment?
Yeah, so when we were architecting this chain sometime early last year, essentially, we were trying to think of the best ways we could go around, best protections we can have for users. There's very unrealistic risk management expectations for users. Even people who've been using DeFi and people who've been using crypto for years and years have issues right now trying to navigate this space. There's a very high level of unreasonable risk management. So we want to make sure that through network permissions, through approval identity framework, we create a safer environment for not just the current users, but more importantly, new users, and new users who want to increase adoption of the space, new users we want to attract into the digital asset space, which aren't already involved in the ecosystem, as well as institutions and other players in the market. So we have been slowly building up this model. It wasn't all there at the start. We've been slowly adding more and more to it. It's still a work in progress, of course, given that we are still building for the next year or so before we go on to mainnet. But there's more things that we will look at down the line in the future. But as a base level, we're pretty satisfied with the model we have right now in terms of network permissions, a approval identity framework that's going to manage and alleviate a lot of risk that people have in DeFi right now.
And it definitely sounds like this is going to alleviate a lot of that. I think we started about crypto around about the same time. And after many years, I still worry a lot when I'm doing crypto transactions. And again, talking about what you've just spoken about for the last 2 or 3 minutes or so is you've created this framework and you've created this blockchain, right? Haven1, and it's really cool, really interesting. As an outsider looking in, my perception is that this seems geared towards like a B2B or institutional sort of blockchain, and they really need that safety and that security. Maybe they're transferring large amounts of money, or they're doing other sort of complex transactions that require that. Is this the case, or am I perceiving this wrong?
Yeah, so we are targeting both retail and institutions. One of the primary concerns for institutional investors as well as developers is the lack of regulatory clarity around DeFi. The decentralized nature of Ethereum and some other blockchains, they lead to an absence of knowledge of the intermediaries, which make it challenging for DeFi to fit into the existing regulatory frameworks. As we know, there's a lot of problems going on in terms of the SEC, DOJ, and other major entities trying to regulate the space without proper legislation. And through working in Yield App investments team, we've spoken to a number of partner funds institutions who said they're super keen to deploy on chain, but they can't right now because there's no assurance in terms of the counterparty risk. When you put funds in Compound or Aave or any other DeFi protocol, you just don't know who the other counterparties are involved. When a fund might want to put USDC in a borrowing pool, their counterparty risk is every single borrower. Anyone who borrows could be involved in terrorist financing or money laundering or whatever. So yeah, there's issues. There's a lot of issues for them there. So our approval identity framework safeguards against these kind of activities, because when you require users to verify on-chain to execute these transactions, we will have regular monitoring and a compliance team, which we use at Yield Up right now already. But we're going to leverage that team onto Haven1, and they'll be continuously monitoring activity for users and their wallets to make sure that anyone who participates in on-chain activity and on Haven1 is compliant with all the regulations that they're supposed to be. They're not like participating in any illicit activities. They're not doing any wrongful stuff. So yeah, we're all about trying to allow assurance for institutions and other people to deploy funds on chain without having that kind of worry. It's good for developers as well, because like developers can also, through this framework, developers can also restrict and enable any users from a specific region for the app. For example, if you've got a German company that only wants German users to interact with their app, that's something they can do. Through the approval identity framework, they can set restrictions for only German users to use their app, and then that way they'll be compliant with the German regulations or whatever. So yeah, there's a key value proposition here, not just for the institutions, but also for developers and other kind of parties who want to restrict or limit users on their platform.
That's fantastic. And I know, speaking to a number of projects over the years from east to west, geo restrictions are a problem in the sense of you do have to restrict, because otherwise you'll get in trouble, because you're allowing these people from this country, and in this country it's illegal, and this country will say, hey, X company or X app, why are you doing this? This is breaking our laws. We don't allow it, etc. So Haven1 is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is based in Australia, right? But at some point, to be able to facilitate this regulated nature, right, you might be having an office in the States or having an office in the EU to facilitate companies saying, okay, we want to be able to use your app, and you have to meet compliance and regulatory frameworks in those sort of zones, if I'm not mistaken.
So essentially, we've got the foundation, it's the Haven1 Foundation. We are registered in Switzerland. That's where the foundation is registered. Switzerland's got a strong reputation for regulation. They've got a very flexible legal framework for blockchain projects. I suppose an Australian company does want to deploy on Haven1 and they're registered in Australia. It'll just be how the general rules work, given that if they want to deploy on a Swiss foundation or Swiss company, then it'll just be whatever the usual corporate laws, how the corporate laws work. Given that we are in Switzerland, there's going to be a lot of transparency. We're going to follow all the rules that's required in terms of all the commercial requirements. Yeah, it'll just be essentially like an Australian company interacting with a Switzerland company with a lot of transparency on chain. So that's pretty much, yeah, this is going to be like a business transaction.
Cool. You said a lot of exciting things, Akash. So people watching and listening to the podcast, they're like, okay, I'm really excited. I'm interested. What would you like their first step to be? Is it going to your Discord, Telegram, following you on Twitter? If they're a developer, what should they do? If they're like a regular retail customer, okay, I can't wait to start trading on Haven1. What steps do you encourage people to take?
Yeah, we've got a Twitter page as well as a Discord right now, which we're leveraging to build the community. Currently, we are in a private testnet. We deployed the first private testnet in February. We're up to the third deployment of the private testnet now, so a lot of testing and building going on. We keep adding new features. There's a lot of load balancing that needs to be adjusted before we release a public testnet. We're going to start onboarding users on the public testnet by, I think, early August. So 7th August is the date that we're going to start onboarding private yield communities on chain. And we aim to have it fully public open by Q3. So by the end of September, ideally. Probably a bit earlier than that, but it's always better to be on the safer side. Yeah, we're going to have a incentivized testnet campaign. We're going to have developer events at the end of the year, as well as a developer hackathon, and leading up to a mainnet launch in, I think, Q1 in the first half of 2024. So yeah, there's the best way to get involved in the community will be follow on Twitter or join the Discord. There'll be a lot going on in the next few months in terms of testing activities. There's a bunch of apps being deployed on chain so that people will have a chance to play around with it and just see how things go, and of course give us a good feedback. Testnets are meant to be played around with and broken, so we're keen to get as much feedback as we can from the community.
Nice. That's awesome. That's an interesting roadmap. And it's Q1 next year is not that far away. So if you're somebody who's interested in Haven1, you're just waiting less than a year. So that's really awesome. Building out Haven1, right? You've talked about some of the things you've done. What were the challenges in creating this really interesting architecture, multi-layered security approach?
So the biggest challenge is the technology side. We're using GoQuorum, which is a Ethereum client, which is a fork of ETH, but it's a private permission client. So no one's ever really deployed a blockchain using GoQuorum, a public blockchain. So GoQuorum is an open source platform which was created by JP Morgan. It's currently being managed by Consensus, and we are working very closely with the Consensus team to upgrade it and work on new improvements on the GoQuorum system. So GoQuorum is usually meant for private blockchains, but how we're using it is to create a public blockchain out of GoQuorum, and there's a bunch of different things that we need to do, evolve GoQuorum into to create that kind of model. So it's a public blockchain, but with permissions. So not a lot of developers know how to work GoQuorum, especially in the Web3 space. We've got to leverage a lot of the Web2 developers and train them in how Web3 works. So it's a mix of both Web2 and Web3 spaces. So finding those developers has been the biggest challenge. Yeah, and it's harder to find people who are keen to work on new things rather than something they've already worked on before because they're already experts in that. So the tech side has been the biggest challenge. In terms of future, given that there's so many different L1s launching and L2s launching in the second half of the year, as well as early next year, differentiating ourselves and building this entire brand narrative of Haven1 is something I do foresee as the biggest future challenge as well. We have to essentially get people to understand how different we are compared to any other public blockchain out there. So we have these benefits, we have these kind of value propositions that's not really available in other blockchains. A network permission model with guardrails. We've got this identity framework that, institutions as well as developers and even some mom and dad investors, retail investors will appreciate. So we're building a bridge between Web 2 and Web 3. So that's something we need to build a narrative around, we need to educate people, we really need to get more people involved in the space. And we do think it's the best way to do it.
And I totally agree with you as well, Akash. You're doing a great job so far, and it sounds really interesting. And especially, like you said, like to me, I think the beginning of this podcast was the best sort of differentiator where you explained the security architecture and the structure. And it's fascinating, honestly. Like I can't wait to spend more time reading about Go Quorum as well. Akash, I think one of the questions as well, when I mentioned to our audience, I'm like, hey, Akash Mahendra from Haven1 is coming on. People were like, okay, this is really cool, another new blockchain. But they were like, what are the plans for the typical sort of infrastructure you might get with a new blockchain in terms of a Uniswap or a QuickSwap or an NFT trading marketplace? Are those things that you guys are going to create, like blockchain gaming perhaps? Do you expect those kind of dApps to build on top of Haven1, or is Haven1 going to be something different perhaps?
So we will have a suite of DeFi products that are available on every blockchain. So essentially, yes, there's going to be the usual DeFi, you know, the AMM, the lending market, the perpetual protocols. We partner with a lot of developers already that are building on-chain. Just to clarify, one of the key value propositions on Haven1 is that the main native infrastructure, so that's the main AMM, the main lending market, the perpetuals protocol will all be owned by the chain itself. So we're building all that native infrastructure. So that's going to avoid a significant amount of liquidity fragmentation, which is a problem on new blockchain. And all the benefits go to the BH1 token holders. So not only you get the gas token, the application token, but also all these application fees and revenue is going to flow to the token itself. So that's going to be a huge plus because we won't have fragmented liquidity all across the blockchain, which prevents proper trading and arbitrage and whatnot. But yes, so something we are working on Haven1 is because of the identity framework, we already got certain benefits that other chains don't have. So that it allows for certain kind of applications, you know, which aren't easily built on Ethereum. One of the developers we are working on is going to provide on-chain T-bills, treasury bills to users. So it's harder to build that on Ethereum because every user who you want to sell T-bills to or associated tokens needs to be verified and needs to pass a certain amount of risk checks, as well as you need to be a advanced investor of some sort. So when you're on Haven1, when the developer builds that kind of product, essentially you automatically limit who interacts with you. There's different levels of verification, of course. There's different people in different countries. So you can, developers got that advantage that they can already set that up in terms of who they want to sell T-bills to, who they don't want to sell T-bills to, whatnot. So that's a huge plus. Another developer team that we're working with is integrating like real-world credit scores into lending markets. All these things are much more difficult to do in DeFi. So in Haven1's on-chain finance, it facilitates new use cases such as identity, as well as leveraging real-world assets, real-world credit scores, and also, of course, settlement of tokenized digital assets as well. So it's much easier for developers to build that kind of stuff on Haven1 compared to, say, Ethereum or any other public blockchain where we don't know who the intermediaries are and you don't have verified people on chain.
That's totally true. And like the T-bill stuff sounds really interesting because I know as I lived in Taiwan for 14 years and accessing financial products and verifying my ID as not being 100% Taiwanese, and it's a pain. So I really like the idea of developers having access to that identity framework, as you mentioned. Akash, it's been an impressive podcast and so many cool ideas and so many fun things. And I'm super excited about Haven1 already. And it's that time of the podcast where I always ask the guest, is there anything else that we haven't talked about with regards to Haven1 that you want to talk about, that you want to mention? Any pearls of wisdom that you'd like to leave our audience? As you already know, right, I have an unlimited schedule, so the floor is yours.
I think there's a good high-level overview given on Haven1. If anyone wants to get involved, they can contact us through Twitter or for Discord. There's a bunch of things which we're going to, as I mentioned before, which we're going to go through in terms of community building. That's testnets and developer events. We're going to be at all the major events, the conferences and events in the future as well. So there's a lot going on. We haven't really pushed the marketing and community building side just yet because we just been focusing on development for the past 12 months. So in the next 6 months, I think there'll be a bigger shift towards the marketing and community side. And we'd always be keen for any developers or any community members to get involved and ask us questions. And there's going to be a grants program for developers as well. So a lot of positive things happening in the next 6 months or so.
That's exciting. You're on this podcast, right? For people who are like, okay, I'm an Akash Mahendra fan right now. Are you going to be on future podcasts? Are you going to be making more videos in the future for people to follow Haven1's progress?
Yeah, we were going to push the media side a lot more. There's a bunch of things planned. Look, I'm not really sure on what the next podcast will be, but we're going to start doing a lot of community calls, Twitter spaces, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of private community calls happening with the yield up community in terms of what we're building, demonstrations and that sort of thing. But yeah, there's definitely going to be quite a lot in the future on not just for me, but all the other developers and the public facing side as well.
Nice. That's exciting. Akash, I have Haven1's socials, Yield socials as well. Are there any of your socials you'd want to share for people to follow you?
I do have a Twitter, but it's not really, I mean, it is active, but I have about 200 followers. Just everything goes through the Haven1 official Twitter handle. That's probably the main source of information for anyone out there.
Sounds good. Perfect. Akash, thank you so much for your time. It has been a wonderful podcast. I've enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to the audience watching it and listening to it live when it does come out. Hopefully we can catch up next year in Q1 when you guys have finally launched. It'll be exciting to talk about some of the dApps that are live and on the actual Haven1 blockchain. I'm looking forward to catching up next year, and thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Crown, and it's great to be here.